The prelude to Operation Suvorov, the Soviet offensive aimed at retaking Smolensk in 1943, was defined by the shifting balance of the Eastern Front following the Battle of Kursk and the subsequent Soviet advances into Western Russia. Smolensk, located roughly 360 kilometers west of Moscow, had been under German control since July 1941 and served as a vital logistical and command hub for Army Group Center. The city anchored the German defensive network between the Dnieper and Desna rivers and controlled major road and rail routes connecting Minsk, Orsha, and Bryansk. For the Germans, retaining Smolensk was critical for maintaining the stability of the central sector, ensuring lateral mobility between their armies and buying time to complete deeper defensive lines further west. For the Soviet High Command, the summer of 1943 presented an opportunity to exploit the Wehrmacht's growing strain. Following their victory at Kursk in July, the Red Army sought to press its advantage by launching coordinated offensives along multiple fronts, aiming to drive the Germans back toward Belarus and eastern Poland. The Western, Kalinin, and Bryansk fronts, commanded by Generals Vasily Sokolovsky, Andrei Yeryomenko, and Markian Popov, respectively, were assigned the task of breaking through the Smolensk region. Collectively, these fronts fielded approximately 1.25 million troops, supported by more than 1,400 tanks and self-propelled guns, including T-34s, KV-1s, and Su-122s, as well as over 20,000 artillery pieces and mortars. Their combined strength dwarfed the German forces in the sector, but was offset by the formidable defensive preparations that Army Group Center had undertaken since early 1943. German strength in the Smolensk region consisted of roughly 850,000 troops under the command of Field Marshal Günther von Kluge. The 3rd Panzer Army, the 4th Army, and the 9th Army defended the sector with around 500 tanks and assault guns, primarily Panzer IVs, Stu G3s, and a limited number of Panthers, supported by over 6,000 artillery pieces and mortars. The Germans had constructed a deeply layered defense-in-depth system, including 3 main defensive belts extending up to 100 kilometers westward from the front line. These belts incorporated fortified villages, bunkers, trench systems, anti-tank ditches, and extensive minefields. The terrain itself favored the defenders, with dense forests, numerous rivers, and swampy lowlands complicating any large-scale Soviet armored advance. The broader geopolitical context added urgency to both sides' preparations. By mid-1943, the Soviet Union aimed not only to liberate occupied territories, but to inflict sufficient damage on Army Group Center to preclude major German counteroffensives during the winter. Success in retaking Smolensk would also place the Red Army in position to threaten Belarus directly, undermining the German grip on the Central Front. For Germany, holding Smolensk as long as possible was intended to buy time for the construction of new defensive lines along the Dnieper and Berezina rivers, and to stabilize the front before the expected arrival of Allied operations in Western Europe. Weather and logistical realities shaped the preconditions for the operation. August 1943 brought warm temperatures and heavy rainfall in some sectors, turning unpaved roads into mud and slowing Soviet supply movements. The Red Army devoted significant resources to engineer operations, constructing corduroy roads and temporary bridges to sustain their artillery and tank movements. The Germans, while benefiting from pre-positioned supply depots, faced fuel shortages that constrained the mobility of their panzer reserves. Both sides understood that the coming offensive would demand extensive logistical coordination to maintain their combat power across the heavily contested terrain. By late August 1943, all elements for the Smolensk campaign were in place. The Soviet Western and Kalinin fronts massed their forces along a 400-kilometer arc, preparing to launch their offensive on a broad front to disperse German reserves and force multiple breakthroughs. Army Group Center, aware of the imminent threat through reconnaissance and intelligence intercepts, positioned its mobile reserves for rapid counterattacks while relying on the depth of its prepared defenses to absorb the Soviet assault. The confrontation promised to be one of the most sustained and costly campaigns of 1943, with the outcome influencing the operational balance on the Eastern Front for the remainder of the year. The opening phase of Operation Suvorov began on 7 August 1943, when the Soviet Western, Kalinin, and Bryansk fronts launched their first coordinated attacks against Army Group Center's defensive lines in the Smolensk region. The offensive commenced following extensive artillery preparation, with over 20,000 guns and mortars firing nearly 250,000 shells across a 400-kilometer front during the opening day. Soviet infantry formations from the 31st, 33rd, and 49th Armies spearheaded the initial assaults, supported by elements of the 5th Mechanized Corps and 2 Tank Corps, fielding more than 400 operational T-34s, KV-1s, and lighter T-70s. The offensive aimed to breach the first of 3 German defensive belts north and south of Yartsevo along the Smolensk-Roslavel axis and create corridors for deeper armored exploitation toward Smolensk. German defenses, commanded by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge and organized under the 4th and 9th Armies, absorbed the first blows with pre-sighted artillery fire, minefields, and counterattacks by mobile reserves. The initial front was held by approximately 400,000 German troops, with panzer and motorized divisions, including the 2nd and 20th Panzer Divisions, kept in reserve for immediate response. Roughly 200 operational tanks and assault guns, primarily Panzer IVs and Stu G3s, were committed in short, sharp counterblows to contain Soviet penetrations before they could be reinforced. These counterattacks, coordinated with Luftwaffe sorties from close air support units, delayed Soviet advances and inflicted early equipment losses. Despite heavy preparation, the Soviet breakthroughs on the first day were limited. On average, gains amounted to 2 to 3 kilometers in sectors where German minefields and anti-tank obstacles forced Soviet armor into narrow corridors. At Yelnya, a focal point of the Western Front's assault, Soviet infantry secured several fortified villages, but at significant cost, as German artillery and counterattacks inflicted over 5,000 casualties in the first 24 hours. Soviet tank units lost around 60 vehicles, many to mines, and concealed 75mm anti-tank guns. German losses on the same day included roughly 2,000 killed and wounded, along with 18 tanks and assault guns destroyed or disabled. In the days following the initial assaults, Soviet commanders pushed reinforcements forward to sustain momentum. The 10th Guards Army and 68th Army were committed from reserve, bringing fresh infantry and additional armor to the Smolensk-Yartsevo sector. Artillery barrages continued at high intensity, with up to 40,000 shells per day allocated to critical breakthrough attempts. German forces, though absorbing heavy bombardment, maintained a flexible defense, executing fighting withdrawals to secondary positions while committing panzer reserves to seal breaches. Luftwaffe aircraft, operating in smaller numbers due to fuel shortages, provided targeted support against Soviet troop concentrations and supply lines, slowing their ability to consolidate gains. The first week of the operation revealed the resilience of the German defensive network. The Triple Belt system, combined with rivers such as the Dnieper and Desna, forced the Soviets to conduct deliberate, costly assaults rather than rapid exploitation. While the Red Army achieved localized successes, advancing up to 8 kilometers in some sectors by 14 August, no decisive breakthrough had yet been achieved. Civilian populations in the combat zones faced forced evacuations, requisitioning of food and shelter by both armies, and destruction from constant artillery exchanges, leaving large areas depopulated and devastated. By the end of this opening phase, both sides had taken significant losses, but remained committed to the battle. Soviet forces had suffered an estimated 80,000 killed and wounded, and the loss of roughly 300 tanks during the first week, while German casualties totaled approximately 40,000 killed and wounded, along with 90 tanks and assault guns destroyed or disabled. The stage was set for the next stage of the offensive, as Soviet High Command prepared larger mechanized thrusts to try to break through the remaining belts, while German commanders reorganized their reserves for counteroffensives aimed at stabilizing the front before it fractured under the weight of the Soviet advance. The strategic planning phase of Operation Suvorov reflected the contrasting priorities and constraints of the Soviet and German commands after the inconclusive results of the opening assaults. The Soviet High Command, determined to capitalize on the weakening state of Army Group Center, reassessed its initial tactics. The Western Front under General Vasily Sokolovsky, the Kalinin Front led by Andrei Yeryomenko, and the Bryansk Front, commanded by Markian Popov, coordinated to deliver successive blows aimed at wearing down German forces rather than achieving a single rapid breakthrough. Their plan called for sustained, staggered offensives along the Smolensk-Roslavel axis, with a gradual shift of weight toward the central and southern sectors where the terrain allowed for more effective armored operations. Reinforcements from the 5th Guards Tank Army and the 4th Shock Army were deployed to bolster the offensive, bringing the Soviet total to over 1.3 million troops, 200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and nearly 23,000 artillery pieces by late August. Logistics became a central focus for Soviet planners. The advance depended on maintaining a steady flow of ammunition, fuel, and replacement equipment across a devastated region where bridges and roads had been systematically destroyed during the German retreats earlier in the summer. Soviet engineers laid corduroy roads, repaired rail lines where possible, and established forward supply depots to reduce delays in resupplying tank corps and artillery units. These measures, however, slowed the overall tempo of the offensive, as large sections of the Western and Bryansk fronts could not sustain continuous operations without frequent pauses for logistical regrouping. Soviet doctrine, rooted in deep operations theory, aimed to break the German line through successive waves, but commanders increasingly recognized that the depth and complexity of the German defensive belts required more deliberate and resource-intensive efforts. On the German side, Army Group Center under Field Marshal Günther von Kluge revised its own strategy to prolong the defense of Smolensk as long as possible while conserving manpower and mechanized reserves. The 3rd Panzer Army, 4th Army, and 9th Army continued to man 3 defensive belts with around 800,000 troops, but the emphasis shifted to flexible defense, with infantry divisions holding fortified villages and strongpoints while panzer divisions remained mobile, prepared to launch immediate counterattacks against any Soviet breakthroughs. German logistics faced its own challenges. Though the Smolensk hub provided access to lateral and rear area rail networks, Soviet air raids and partisan sabotage disrupted transport routes, forcing reliance on horse-drawn convoys and limiting the ability to concentrate fuel and ammunition for large-scale counteroffensives. German commanders also prioritized the construction of fallback lines along the Desna and Dnieper to ensure an organized withdrawal should Smolensk become untenable. Both sides suffered from planning miscalculations during this phase. Soviet intelligence underestimated the depth of the German fortifications beyond the first defensive belt, expecting a faster collapse once initial positions were breached. This led to premature commitments of tank corps, which encountered successive layers of minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and interlocking fields of fire that inflicted significant losses. German intelligence, meanwhile, underestimated the scale of Soviet artillery and the rapidity with which engineers could restore logistical pathways, leading to several panzer counterattacks being met by pre-sighted Soviet guns and concentrated firepower, causing avoidable losses. Propaganda efforts mirrored the operational stakes. Soviet broadcasts and publications emphasized the liberation of the Smolensk region as a crucial step toward driving the Wehrmacht out of Belarus, and ultimately Poland, seeking to sustain morale despite mounting casualties. German internal communications framed the battle as essential for buying time to stabilize the Central Front, warning commanders and troops that the loss of Smolensk would expose Army Group Center to deeper Soviet penetrations before winter, with potentially catastrophic consequences. By the final days of August 1943, the plans of both sides converged on a protracted battle of attrition. Soviet forces prepared concentrated assaults along narrower sectors, aiming to wear down German defenses belt by belt, while Army Group Center positioned its reserves to deliver repeated counterblows designed to delay Soviet advances without committing to fixed-line defenses that risked encirclement. This phase of strategic recalibration set the conditions for the escalating clashes of early September, as both sides committed to intensified operations with the aim of either breaking or preserving the central defensive anchor of the Eastern Front. The first major clashes of September 1943 in Operation Suvorov began as Soviet forces, having reorganized after their initial assaults, launched concentrated attacks to breach the Second German Defensive Belt and drive closer to Smolensk. On 7th of September, the Western Front's 31st and 68th Armies, supported by over 400 tanks and self-propelled guns from the 5th Guards Tank Corps, attacked along a 30-kilometer front near Yartsevo and Dorogobuj. The offensive opened with an artillery barrage that delivered over 180,000 shells in 6 hours, targeting fortified villages, trench lines, and known artillery positions. Infantry formations advanced behind the bombardment, with armored units following to exploit any gaps. The goal was to advance at least 10 kilometers in the first 2 days, seize crossings over the Vop and Dnieper tributaries, and open a path to Smolensk from the northeast. German defenses, though battered by weeks of combat, absorbed the initial blows using pre-sighted artillery fire, dense minefields, and a network of fallback positions. The Fourth Army, holding this sector with roughly 250,000 troops, relied heavily on its mobile reserves from the 12th and 20th Panzer Divisions, which together fielded about 150 operational tanks, primarily Panzer IVs and Stu G3s, to counterattack Soviet penetrations. The first day of fighting saw Soviet infantry capture 3 villages and advance 3 to 5 kilometers along several points, but German counterattacks retook 2 of the positions by nightfall, inflicting losses on Soviet armor that had outrun infantry support. Luftwaffe sorties, though limited by fuel and weather, struck Soviet assembly areas and bridges, slowing reinforcements. The fighting intensified around Dorogobuj, where Soviet forces attempted to cross the Vop River under constant artillery and small arms fire. Engineer units constructed pontoon bridges under fire, enabling limited numbers of T-34s to cross by 8th September. However, German artillery destroyed several crossings, and counterattacks by elements of the 2nd Panzer Division stalled the Soviet bridgehead, destroying or disabling 25 tanks over 2 days. Soviet infantry, though establishing a foothold on the western bank, suffered heavy casualties, over 7,000 killed and wounded, before consolidating their positions by 10th September. German losses in the sector reached 3,500 killed and wounded, along with 20 tanks lost, many to concentrated artillery fire during their counter-maneuvers. Civilians in the contested areas endured significant hardships as villages were systematically fortified or demolished. German forces evacuated thousands of residents to prevent them from aiding Soviet troops, while Soviet artillery bombardments leveled entire settlements suspected of harboring German positions. The resulting devastation created a barren, cratered landscape that slowed armored movement and forced both sides to expend additional resources on road and bridge construction to maintain operational tempo. Unexpected developments marked this phase of the battle. On 9th September, a Soviet breakthrough attempt near Yartsevo briefly created a 5-kilometer gap in the German line when a battalion-sized German strongpoint was overrun. Soviet tank brigades pushed into the gap but were quickly countered by a coordinated strike from the 20th Panzer Division and 2 battalions of Stug-3s, which encircled and destroyed 36 T-34s and forced a withdrawal. This engagement highlighted the risks of advancing without secure flanks and underscored the effectiveness of German mobile defense, even under mounting attrition. By mid-September, Soviet advances in this phase averaged 6 to 8 kilometers across several sectors, but Smolensk itself remained more than 40 kilometers from the forward lines. Soviet casualties for the first half of September are estimated at 65,000 killed and wounded, with 220 tanks destroyed or disabled. German losses during the same period totaled roughly 32,000 killed and wounded, along with 70 tanks and assault guns lost, many of which were immobilized due to mechanical failures exacerbated by continuous redeployment. The battles of early September confirmed that neither side could secure rapid results, and that the contest for Smolensk would be decided by persistent, costly engagements rather than swift breakthroughs. Through the second half of September 1943, Operation Suvorov escalated into a broader crisis for both the Soviet and German commands as combat intensified around the approaches to Smolensk and Roslavel. Soviet forces, intent on breaking through the remaining German defensive belts, committed additional armies and mechanized formations to sustain pressure across a 200-kilometer front. The Western Front deployed the 10th Guards Army, 33rd Army, and 21st Army, alongside the already engaged 31st and 68th Armies, bringing their total strength in the sector to over 1.3 million troops, supported by approximately 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Artillery fire reached unprecedented volumes, with over 300,000 shells fired during concentrated preparations on 15 to 16 September alone. The Soviet goal was to breach the final major defensive lines northeast of Smolensk, capture Roslavel as a secondary objective, and open the corridor toward Orsha and Vitebsk. German forces, though under mounting strain, maintained cohesive defenses by consolidating their formations and relying heavily on mobile reserves. The 4th Army and elements of the 9th Army, totaling around 700,000 troops, operated with about 350 tanks and assault guns, mainly Panzer IVs, Stug-3s, and a shrinking number of Panthers due to mechanical attrition. The German defensive doctrine emphasized elastic defense, with infantry holding fortified strongpoints while panzer divisions launched concentrated counterattacks to prevent Soviet exploitation. Fuel shortages, however, forced commanders to prioritize the most threatened sectors, reducing the frequency and scale of armored counterblows compared to earlier phases. The fighting during this period was marked by several intense clashes around key crossing points and fortified villages. On 18th September, near the Dnieper tributary south of Yartsevo, Soviet engineers established 3 pontoon bridges under heavy fire, enabling a combined force of 2 rifle divisions and 60 T-34s to cross. The bridgehead expanded to 4 kilometers before being struck by a counterattack from the 12th Panzer Division and supporting assault guns, which recaptured 2 crossings and destroyed or disabled 28 Soviet tanks. Soviet infantry, though holding 1 remaining bridgehead, suffered over 9,000 casualties in the engagement, while German losses reached approximately 3,500, including 12 tanks knocked out by concentrated artillery. Further south, the Bryansk front advanced on Roslavel with the 50th Army and the 3rd Tank Corps, capturing several fortified positions by 21 September, but encountering stiff resistance from the 9th Army's reserves. German forces launched a series of counterattacks using combined arms teams of infantry, Stug-3s, and Panzer IVs, regaining ground around critical road junctions and delaying the Soviet advance by a week. Casualties in the Roslavel sector were significant, with the Red Army losing roughly 15,000 killed and wounded and 60 tanks, while German forces suffered around 7,500 casualties and 25 armored vehicles. The terrain and logistical challenges intensified the crisis. Persistent rain turned unpaved roads into mud, bogging down supply convoys and limiting the maneuverability of armored units. Soviet engineers continued to construct makeshift roads and bridges, but delays in ammunition and fuel delivery slowed the operational tempo. German supply lines, harassed by partisan sabotage and Soviet air raids, relied increasingly on horse-drawn transport and improvised stockpiles closer to the front, making them vulnerable to disruption. By late September, Soviet forces had advanced an additional 15 to 20 kilometers along several axes, placing Smolensk within 25 kilometers of their forward positions and threatening Roslavl from two directions. However, the cost was immense. Soviet casualties for the latter half of September are estimated at over 95,000 killed and wounded, with around 300 tanks destroyed or disabled. German forces, while holding much of the line, suffered approximately 50,000 casualties and 90 armored vehicles lost during the same period, further depleting their reserves. The stage was set for the peak of the campaign, as both sides prepared for climactic fighting around Smolensk itself, while grappling with exhaustion, supply shortages, and worsening weather conditions that threatened to stall operations altogether. By the final week of September 1943, Operation Suvorov reached its most intense stage as Soviet forces launched coordinated attacks designed to break the last German defensive lines around Smolensk and Roslavl. The Western and Kalinin fronts concentrated over 1.4 million troops along a 150-kilometer front, supported by roughly 1,100 operational tanks and self-propelled guns, including T-34s, Su-122s, and KV-1s. Artillery concentrations exceeded 23,000 guns and mortars, delivering more than 400,000 shells between 25 and 28 September alone. Soviet planners aimed to capture Smolensk and Roslavl simultaneously, severing key lateral transport routes and forcing Army Group Center into a deep withdrawal toward Orsha and the Dnieper Line before October's rains further hampered mobility. German forces, despite sustaining heavy losses during the preceding weeks, mounted a determined defense with approximately 650,000 troops. The 4th and 9th Armies fielded around 320 tanks and assault guns, primarily Panzer IVs and Stu-G3s, with few operational Panthers remaining due to breakdowns and fuel rationing. The German command, led by Field Marshal von Kluge, positioned panzer divisions behind key sectors for rapid counterattacks while constructing fallback lines to the west to avoid encirclement should Smolensk fall. The defensive effort depended heavily on artillery and entrenched infantry, as fuel shortages limited the mobility and frequency of mechanized counterblows. The offensive toward Smolensk began on 25 September, with a 6-hour artillery bombardment targeting German fortifications, supply depots, and command centers. Following the barrage, Soviet infantry from the 31st, 33rd, and 68th Armies advanced, supported by more than 400 tanks in the first wave. The initial assaults achieved notable gains, breaching portions of the final defensive belt northeast of Smolensk and capturing 5 fortified villages by nightfall. German reserves, including the 20th Panzer Division and assault gun battalions, counterattacked in the evening, retaking 2 of the villages and stalling further Soviet advances along the Smolensk-Roslavl road. Simultaneously, the Bryansk front advanced on Roslavl from the southeast with the 50th Army and elements of the 3rd Tank Corps. Despite muddy conditions slowing their armor, Soviet forces forced German defenders from several positions and cut secondary roads linking Roslavl to Orsha. German counterattacks, mounted by the 9th Army's remaining reserves, briefly stabilized the sector but could not prevent a gradual Soviet encirclement threat. Fighting devolved into close-quarters engagements, with both sides contesting control of road junctions and river crossings under constant artillery fire. Civilian suffering reached its peak during these days. Many villages in the combat zones were leveled by artillery and airstrikes, either as deliberate defensive measures or as collateral destruction during Soviet assaults. Thousands of residents were evacuated or displaced as front lines shifted, with food shortages intensifying due to the requisitioning of supplies by both armies. Roads clogged with refugees and military traffic further complicated supply efforts, slowing reinforcements and ammunition delivery for both sides. Losses mounted at a pace not seen earlier in the campaign. Between 25 and 30 September, Soviet forces suffered approximately 70,000 killed and wounded, and the loss of over 250 tanks, many abandoned due to mechanical failures in deep mud or destroyed by German anti-tank teams. German casualties during the same period totaled roughly 40,000 killed and wounded, with 80 tanks and assault guns lost, a significant number disabled by Soviet artillery and airstrikes rather than direct combat. Despite these losses, the Germans managed to delay Soviet forces long enough to begin withdrawing key units from Smolensk and Roslavel without being cut off. By the end of September, Soviet troops had advanced to within 5 kilometers of Smolensk and encircled Roslavel from the north and east, forcing German forces to prepare for a staged withdrawal. The stage was set for the final assaults to seize both cities, as worsening weather and overextended supply lines pressured Soviet commanders to secure decisive results before heavy autumn rains brought large-scale operations to a halt. In the first days of October 1943, as Operation Suvorov continued, both Soviet and German forces adapted their tactics to cope with the exhaustion of troops, severe logistical strain, and the rapid deterioration of weather conditions that threatened to halt the campaign altogether. Soviet forces, now holding positions within a few kilometers of Smolensk and tightening their grip around Roslavel, shifted from large-scale frontal attacks to methodical, combined arms operations designed to erode German resistance sector by sector. The Western Front retained around 1.3 million combat-ready troops, but its armored strength had been reduced to roughly 900 operational tanks and self-propelled guns due to weeks of heavy losses and mechanical failures. Artillery, still numbering over 20,000 guns and mortars, became the primary instrument of offensive pressure, with barrages focusing on isolating fortified villages and cutting off retreat routes before infantry and armor advanced. German forces, tasked with delaying the Soviet advance while preserving their combat strength for an organized withdrawal, adopted a strategy of defense in depth, combined with frequent local counterattacks. The 4th and 9th Armies together fielded about 600,000 troops, supported by 280 operational tanks and assault guns. Panzer divisions, many operating at half their original strength, were deployed in small groups to strike at Soviet breakthroughs, while infantry divisions fortified successive fallback lines to the west. The Germans intensified efforts to construct defensive positions along the Berezina and Dnieper corridors, ensuring that even as Smolensk and Roslavel became untenable, retreating forces could regroup on prepared ground. The battles during this phase were characterized by their localized yet ferocious nature. On 3rd of October, near the village of Kardimovo, the Soviet 33rd Army launched an assault, supported by 120 T-34s and heavy artillery fire, seeking to sever one of the last functioning roads out of Smolensk for the German 4th Army. The attack initially captured several fortified positions, but was met by a counterattack from elements of the 20th Panzer Division and 2 assault gun battalions, which recaptured key junctions and destroyed or disabled 40 Soviet tanks. The Soviets, despite holding parts of the area, were unable to cut the road entirely, allowing German convoys to continue their withdrawal under cover of darkness. Around Roslavel, the Bryansk front intensified pressure with coordinated infantry and armor assaults, forcing German defenders to abandon several strongpoints by 5 October. However, the terrain, dominated by forests and swampy lowlands, hampered Soviet armor, forcing much of the fighting into close-range infantry engagements. German defenders, relying heavily on prepared artillery fire and minefields, inflicted significant casualties, even as their own positions became increasingly untenable. Soviet partisans operating in the surrounding forests disrupted German retreat routes, derailed supply trains, and ambushed rear area units, amplifying the pressure on the retreating formations. The psychological toll on both sides grew as the fighting dragged into its third month. Soviet troops, while buoyed by the imminent capture of Smolensk and Roslavel, suffered from shortages of rations and ammunition as supply lines stretched across the devastated landscape. Frostbite and illness began to take a toll as temperatures dropped below freezing at night. German soldiers, aware that the withdrawal was inevitable, fought delaying actions with the goal of minimizing losses rather than holding ground at all costs. A shift in mindset reinforced by directives from Army Group Center, emphasizing the preservation of combat strength over territorial defense. Casualties during this phase continued to rise steadily. From 1 to 7 October, Soviet forces incurred approximately 55,000 killed and wounded and lost 180 tanks, many to mines and concentrated anti-tank fire. German forces suffered around 30,000 killed and wounded, along with the loss of 60 tanks and assault guns, much of their armored attrition resulting from breakdowns and fuel shortages rather than direct engagements. Both sides recognized that the battle was nearing its conclusion, but the methodical Soviet pressure, combined with the degradation of German mobility and defensive cohesion, made the eventual loss of Smolensk and Roslavel inevitable, despite the defenders' efforts to execute an orderly retreat. By the second week of October 1943, Operation Suvorov approached its decisive turning point as the final German positions around Smolensk and Roslavel became untenable under sustained Soviet pressure. The Western Front, now fielding roughly 1.25 million combat-ready troops, focused its efforts on cutting the last withdrawal routes west of Smolensk, while isolating remaining German strongpoints to the south and southeast. Its armored contingent, diminished by attrition, still maintained about 850 operational tanks and self-propelled guns, supported by more than 18,000 artillery pieces. Soviet commanders, aware of the deteriorating weather and logistical strain, aimed to force the German Fourth Army into a hasty retreat to prevent the defenders from establishing cohesive positions along the Berezina and Dnieper corridors. The German forces defending the Smolensk and Roslavel sectors, numbering around 580,000 troops, relied on a shrinking reserve of approximately 240 operational tanks and assault guns, mostly Panzer IVs and Stu G3s. Fuel shortages, coupled with relentless Soviet artillery and partisan sabotage, sharply reduced the mobility of panzer divisions, limiting their counterattacks to localized actions aimed at covering withdrawals rather than regaining lost territory. Infantry divisions, many at 50–60% of their authorized strength, were ordered to hold delaying positions while rear area units dismantled supply depots and destroyed bridges to slow the Soviet advance. The turning point came between 9 and 12 October, when the Soviet 31st, 33rd, and 68th Armies launched coordinated assaults north and south of Smolensk to sever the last two functioning road and rail corridors leading west. These attacks were supported by concentrated artillery barrages, with more than 220,000 shells fired over 3 days, and by approximately 300 tanks advancing through partially frozen, debris-strewn terrain. On 10th of October, near the village of Dukhovshchina, a Soviet thrust managed to envelop a German infantry regiment and overrun 2 battalion-sized strongpoints, cutting one of the key roads. However, counterattacks by the 20th Panzer Division and assault gun battalions, though hampered by fuel shortages, delayed the Soviet drive long enough for most German supply convoys to withdraw west. Around Roslavel, the Bryansk Front's 50th Army, supported by 150 tanks and heavy artillery, breached the outer defenses on 11 October, capturing several fortified villages and severing minor roads connecting Roslavel to Orsha. German defenders, mainly from the 9th Army, launched repeated counterattacks with assault gun companies and infantry reserves, but by 12th of October, Soviet forces controlled the approaches to the city from 3 directions, forcing a staged withdrawal to avoid encirclement. The final retreat involved destroying bridges, railheads, and fuel depots to deny their use to advancing Soviet forces, leaving the area scorched and infrastructure crippled. These final clashes carried a heavy toll. Between 8 and 13 October, Soviet forces suffered roughly 60,000 killed and wounded and lost about 160 tanks, many immobilized in muddy conditions or destroyed by concentrated anti-tank defenses along withdrawal routes. German forces, though avoiding encirclement, sustained approximately 35,000 casualties and lost around 70 tanks and assault guns, with a considerable number abandoned due to mechanical failure and fuel depletion. Civilian populations suffered further dislocation as villages were evacuated or burned during the German retreat, while Soviet artillery bombardments devastated urban districts near the front. By 13th of October, the Soviet advance had broken the cohesion of German defenses east of the Berezina. Smolensk and Roslavel, though not yet fully secured, were effectively cut off from the rest of Army Group Center's prepared lines, forcing the Germans to accelerate their withdrawal toward Orsha and the Dnieper Line. The operational balance had shifted decisively. The Red Army, despite heavy losses and logistical fatigue, now had the momentum, while German forces were committed to a fighting retreat to avoid destruction. The outcome of these days ensured that the Smolensk region would soon return to Soviet control, and that Army Group Center would face a protracted struggle to stabilize new positions further west before winter fully set in. By mid-October 1943, the German withdrawal from Smolensk and Roslavel was underway, but the retreat quickly evolved into a sequence of contested rearguard actions as Soviet forces sought to inflict maximum losses before the defenders could establish new lines along the Berezina and Dnieper. The Western and Bryansk fronts, together fielding approximately 1.2 million troops, pressed their pursuit with around 800 operational tanks and self-propelled guns, backed by more than 17,000 artillery pieces. Soviet commanders prioritized speed to disrupt German attempts at organized withdrawal, deploying mobile detachments, armored spearheads supported by motorized infantry, to seize crossings, sever roads, and cut off isolated units. Despite logistical fatigue, including fuel shortages and overstretched supply lines, the Red Army aimed to convert the German retreat into a route before worsening weather closed the window for maneuver. The German 4th and 9th Armies, now reduced to about 550,000 troops, relied on delaying tactics and layered withdrawals to escape encirclement. Their mechanized reserves, limited to roughly 200 operational tanks and assault guns, were committed sparingly, primarily to cover vital road junctions and river crossings. Rearguard units, often composed of understrength infantry battalions and ad hoc formations, entrenched along choke points to delay Soviet advances while engineers demolished bridges and laid extensive minefields. Luftwaffe sorties, though hampered by fuel shortages and bad weather, targeted Soviet pontoon bridges and congested supply routes, slowing the attackers' momentum. Between 14 and 20 October, the heaviest engagements occurred around key Dnieper and Berezina tributary crossings. On 16 October, near the village of Kolmzyrkovsky, the Soviet 10th Guards Army attempted to capture a vital bridge intact by launching a night assault supported by 60 T-34s and heavy artillery fire. The attack overran German forward positions but failed to secure the bridge before engineers detonated charges, forcing the Soviets to spend 2 days building pontoons under fire. German rearguards, supported by Stu-G3s and 88mm guns, inflicted over 1,000 Soviet casualties and destroyed 18 tanks before withdrawing. German losses totaled around 700 men and 5 assault guns, most abandoned due to mechanical failures after the engagement. Further south, near Roslavl, the Bryansk Front's 50th Army encircled a German infantry regiment on 18 October by cutting its retreat route with 2 tank brigades and concentrated artillery strikes. While most of the encircled unit managed to break out in small groups, it abandoned its heavy equipment, and the engagement cost German forces over 1,500 casualties, including 600 captured. Soviet losses, primarily from counterattacks by German assault gun companies, reached 1,200 men and 15 tanks. Civilian suffering escalated during this phase as retreating German units implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying food stores, rail facilities, and industrial infrastructure to deny their use to advancing Soviet forces. Entire villages were burned, forcing tens of thousands of residents to flee or face deportation. Soviet artillery bombardments, aimed at harassing German convoys, further devastated populated areas along the retreat corridors, compounding the humanitarian crisis. Casualties during this week underscored the cost of the pursuit. Soviet forces suffered approximately 50,000 killed and wounded and lost around 140 tanks, many to mines and ambushes along narrow roads. German forces incurred roughly 38,000 casualties, including 10,000 captured, and lost about 60 tanks and assault guns, most abandoned for lack of fuel or due to breakdowns rather than direct combat. Despite the scale of losses, the Germans managed to prevent the total collapse of their front, maintaining enough cohesion to establish new positions along the Berezina line by late October. By 21 October, the Soviet advance had slowed as overextended supply lines, deteriorating roads, and the onset of autumn rains reduced mobility. While Smolensk and Roslavl were firmly back under Soviet control, the bulk of the German 4th and 9th Armies had withdrawn in relatively organized fashion, preserving their core formations for future defensive operations. The Red Army's inability to fully destroy these forces during the retreat ensured that Army Group Center would remain a significant obstacle in the coming winter and spring campaigns, even as Soviet control of the Smolensk region marked a major strategic gain. By late October 1943, Operation Suvorov drew to a close as the Red Army secured Smolensk and Roslavl, while the German 4th and 9th Armies completed their withdrawal to new defensive positions along the Berezina and Dnieper lines. The Soviet Western and Bryansk fronts, which had fielded over 1.2 million troops at the height of the campaign, saw their strength reduced by attrition and logistical strain. Tank numbers fell to approximately 700 operational vehicles, and artillery remained at roughly 16,000 guns and mortars, though ammunition rationing became stricter as supply lines extended hundreds of kilometers from the rear. The final weeks of the campaign focused on clearing German rearguards, restoring critical transport routes, and consolidating Soviet control over the recaptured region, while preparing for the inevitable winter operations to follow. German forces, despite losing Smolensk and Roslavl, preserved much of their combat strength by executing a controlled, phased retreat. The 4th and 9th Armies, reduced to around 520,000 troops by the end of October, entrenched along the Berezina and Dnieper corridors, where new defensive positions had been prepared since September. Approximately 180 tanks and assault guns, mainly Panzer IVs and Stu-G3s, remained operational, though chronic fuel and spare parts shortages continued to limit mobility. Army Group Center's high command emphasized conserving manpower and mechanized assets, reasoning that stabilizing the front through the winter would buy time to receive reinforcements and prepare deeper fortifications across Belarus before the anticipated Soviet offensives in 1944. The aftermath of the operation left a devastated landscape across the Smolensk region. German forces, implementing scorched earth tactics during their withdrawal, destroyed railways, bridges, food depots, and industrial facilities, rendering many towns uninhabitable. Soviet artillery bombardments, aimed at German retreat routes, further damaged civilian infrastructure. Thousands of villages were burned or abandoned, and hundreds of thousands of civilians were displaced. Many left without shelter as winter approached. The Red Army faced the immediate challenge of restoring basic transport and supply networks to support future offensives, relying on labor battalions and requisitioned local populations to repair roads and rebuild rail connections. Casualties from August to late October reflected the scale of the campaign. Soviet forces suffered an estimated 450,000 killed and wounded, with around 2,400 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed or disabled across the three-month operation. German losses, though lower, were still substantial, totaling approximately 200,000 killed and wounded, with around 700 tanks and assault guns lost, the majority due to a combination of combat, mines, breakdowns, and fuel shortages. The attrition left both sides strained, but the Germans were forced into a defensive posture, while the Soviets emerged with the strategic initiative for the next phase of the war. The broader consequences of Operation Suvorov extended beyond the immediate territorial gains. The recapture of Smolensk and Roslavel reopened crucial transport routes for the Soviet Union, strengthened the Red Army's operational reach into Belarus, and set the stage for the massive summer offensives of 1944. For the Germans, the loss of the Smolensk region marked the collapse of one of their key defensive anchors on the Central Front, and compelled Army Group Center to contract its line significantly, leaving it more vulnerable to future Soviet breakthroughs. In subsequent historical assessments, Operation Suvorov is viewed as a pivotal campaign that eroded Army Group Center's resilience ahead of Operation Bagration, even though it failed to encircle or annihilate large German formations. While the Red Army paid a heavy price in men and material, the campaign demonstrated the maturing coordination of Soviet multi-front operations and the capacity to sustain offensives over months despite logistical and environmental challenges. For the civilians of the Smolensk region, however, the end of the battle brought only partial relief, as devastation and displacement continued to define daily life long after the front had shifted westward. The operation's legacy became a central reference point in both Soviet military doctrine and post-war narratives, symbolizing the hard-fought path to reclaiming Western Russia and paving the way for the liberation of Belarus in 1944.